Hi friends, welcome to another video lecture for our class Paul as Local Theologian. The title of this lecture is Definitions of Theology, and really I hope to answer two basic and fundamental questions for our class. And the first is, what is theology? And the second is, what is a theologian? Now, my sense is that both of these questions are not new or entirely new questions for anyone. There's a good chance that some of you have already taken a theology class at Columbia Theological Seminary, and therefore you've spent a lot of time thinking and processing these sorts of questions. But I think it's important for us to have a shared vocabulary and some shared concepts as we embark on this class together. Briefly, if you'll entertain the possibilities, I would invite you to pause the recording in just a few seconds and write the first things that come to mind with this question. When you think of the word theology, what comes to mind? What is theology? So pause the video and take 30 seconds or a minute just to write whatever comes to mind with that question. Welcome back. I hope that you generated some thoughts or some reflections on theology and what comes to mind. For some of you, theology might have brought to mind a library or an office or a bookshelf full of books. I hope, though, that some of you had your grandmother as an example or as an image related to theology. Or maybe singing and worship were something that came to mind in your reflection on theology. So I want to open with some definitions of theology and then work our way in at the conclusion of the lecture into the question of who is a theologian. So if we look at the question, what is theology, strictly from an etymological perspective, strictly from a sense of the two Greek words that are behind our English word theology, then we would be looking at the word theos, which means God, and logos, which means speech or system or something to that effect. And so just from the basis of those two Greek words, we could say that theology is speech or thinking about or related to God. Another definition by Gonzalez and Perez is that theology is the discipline that studies God. It is a discipline, and its primary object is God. So a biologist or biology is the study of life, the study of living things. It is the discipline that studies living things. Theology, then, is that which studies God. That would be a second definition. And Gonzalez and Perez, in their introduction to Christian theology, explore some of the different functions of theology that are related to that definition. So theology could function to explain reality, or it could be understood as a systematization of belief, or it could be thought of as a defense or a bridge for believers and non-believers. It could even be understood as a critique of the church's life and practice. Or finally, theology could function as a form of contemplation, a spiritual contact with the divine. A third very famous definition is from Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, who said that theology is simply faith seeking understanding. So it starts with faith. It starts with belief. It starts with maybe religious experience or religious convictions, and it works its way into understanding. So it explores what is believed, why is it believed, how is it believed, what's the difference of that belief, and so forth. Faith seeking understanding. Finally, Stone and Duke, in their book, How to Think Theologically, talk about theology is essentially thinking about life in light of faith. Thinking of life in light of faith. I hope that especially these latter definitions have highlighted that theology is an activity. It is not simply a body of knowledge that one masters or one understands, but it is primarily and in the first place an activity of the believer. It is reflection, it is active, and it is a matter of ongoing activity and development. Before moving into the question, who is a theologian, I want to point out that all theology has or should have an adjective. Now, what I mean by that is that there is in some circles the idea that Karl Barth is a theologian, but James Cone is an African American liberation theology. Do you see all of those adjectives? James Cone has all of these adjectives that modify his identity as a theologian, but Karl Barth does not. And so by saying that all theology has an adjective, we are correcting that tendency, which has identified certain figures, certain voices as real or true theologians, and by adding adjectives to other theologians has given them a sort of secondary place. And so the really important thing is that all theology has an adjective. So Karl Barth is not just a theologian. Karl Barth is a Swiss-born, German-speaking theologian living in light of and during the rise of Hitler's power in World War II, right? Those are important things. Those are all aspects of how he goes about doing his work as a theologian. Just as we might talk about James Cone as a black liberationist theologian, writing in the height of the Black Power movement, trying to integrate the thinking of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in his own theological system. So again, all theology has an adjective. This calls attention to the fundamental importance of context. We can't get out of our context. We can't remove ourselves from our context. We might become more critically aware of our context and how our context affects what we do or what we say theologically, but we cannot escape our theology. None of us enters this world without a context. And I think that's a vital thing for us to remember as we talk about theology. And finally, building on that, the theological rationale for affirming our context, my context, your context, is the incarnation. Jesus was born into a context. And the gospel writers in particular try to draw out that. Think about Luke and all of Luke's attention to what was going on in the geopolitical world when Jesus was born. Luke is saying this is the context into which Jesus of Nazareth, the son of the carpenter, was born. So Jesus then sort of free float in the world of the first century, but he was embedded in it. He was a first century Jewish male living under imperial hegemony and the oppression of Roman taxation. That's part of who Jesus was. And as Christians, we affirm that Jesus was both fully human and fully divine with the incarnation. And so that fully human component means that Jesus had a context. And by being born into that context and by being fully human, he highlights that the incarnation highlights the importance of context for theological reflection and theological discourse. Let me briefly conclude by answering the question, who is a theologian? Stone and Duke, again in their book, How to Think Theologically, make this case. They say that to be a Christian at all is to be a theologian. To be a Christian at all is to be a theologian. And I think that this is so right. Sometimes we think about theologians as only those who have a particular number of letters after their name, or only those who have been trained at a particular type of school or institution, or only those who have read a certain number of books. But Stone and Duke say that part of being a Christian is being a theologian. And this highlights that theology is both a given, it is something we receive, it is something that we own, something that's a part of us, and a continuous task. We are constantly learning, we are constantly evolving. When experiences happen in our lives that cause us to say, why God? Or when God? Or how much longer God? These are all instances in which we are doing theology through our lament, through our prayers of hope, and so forth. Stone and Duke suggests that we are all theologians, but that there are differences between what they call embedded theology and deliberative theology. Embedded theology is the theology that we all have, probably a part of our formation and our experience. It is part of how we show up in the world as Christians. This embedded theology, though, when we move from embedded theology to deliberative theology, we begin to reflect on why or how or is this true. Very oftentimes deliberative theology comes when we encounter people whose theology is different than our own. And so when we experience different theologies, or we have experiences that cause us to rethink our beliefs, our theology becomes more deliberative, more purposeful, more critical, more reflective. The point that Stone and Duke make is that we are all theologians. We all think theologically. And what I would add to that, which I think is vital for a class, which I think is vital for seminary overall, is that being theologians, thinking theologically, reflecting theologically, is central to the life of faith. It is central to discipleship. It's not optional. It's not only that which the smart people do when they go to seminary, but it's central to what it means to be a disciple. Remember that disciple in Greek means student. Reflecting theologically is part of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. It's part of what it means to be a Christian. Once again, a theologian is not one who has mastered a particular body of knowledge, but rather a theologian is one who practices a life of theological reflection, of ongoing theological formation, of ongoing theological conversation. What is theology? Theology is faith-seeking understanding. It is a blend of activity and reflection. And who's a theologian? Every Christian's a theologian. You're a theologian. The communities that you lead are full of theologians. And I hope, as we embark on our study of Paul as a theologian, these qualifiers, these definitions, will help us think about the degree to which Paul is a theologian and what kind of theologian he is. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.